More bad polling news for President Joe Biden tonight, but this time it's among fellow Democrats. A New York Times poll of the current election cycle reveals that 1 in 3 Americans polled approve of the job he's doing as president. Just 1 in 3. And that's not the worst of the news for him. The same poll showed that nearly 2/3 of all Democrats polled do not want Biden to run for re-election in 2024. The question I have is, so who tells him? How do you break the news to him? This is astonishing. The midterms are 4 months away, and 64% of Democrats are not supporting a second Biden term. And get this, 94% of Democrats under 30 don't want him to run again. 94%. Today's New York Times, which has generally been supportive of Biden, featured the blaring headline, quote, "Most Democrats don't want Biden in 2024. New poll shows with a sub-headline reading, quote, "With the country gripped by a pervasive sense of pessimism, the president is hemorrhaging support." The article opens with the following sentence, quote, "President Biden is facing an alarming level of doubt from inside his own party, with 64% of Democratic voters saying they would prefer a new standard bearer in the 2024 presidential campaign, according to a New York Times Siena College poll. As voters nationwide have soured on his leadership, giving him a meager 33% job approval rating." And so now, the mainstream media openly questioning the administration over plans for 2024. On Face the Nation yesterday, Vice President Harris was asked about it.
There is speculation among some Democrats and some Republicans that President Biden won't run for re-election in 2024. What's your message to those who say that?
Listen to President Biden. He intends to run. And if he does, I intend to run with him. So there you go.
I don't know how funny it is, regardless of which side you're on. And neither are the president's recent gaffes. Take, for example, Friday's press conference on abortion rights, in which he appeared to read, quote, "repeat the line," straight from the teleprompter.
It is noteworthy that the percentage of women who register to vote and cast a ballot is consistently higher than the percentage of the men who do so. End of quote. Repeat the line. Women are not without electoral and or political, or maybe precise, not and or political power.
Now, look, mistakes are mistakes, and not everyone means he's losing it. But just for comparison, this was just sort of interesting to us. This was Biden speaking publicly less than 5 years ago, appearing on The View.
If I were offered the nomination by the Lord Almighty right now today, I would say no, because we're not ready. The family's not ready to do this. If in a year from now, if they're ready and no one has moved in that I think can do it, then I may very well do it. But I'm being as honest as I can.
Look, there's a difference there. And even before the negative polls, the Times featured a separate story that read, quote, "At 79, Biden is testing the boundaries of age in the presidency," and noted how, quote, "his age has become an uncomfortable issue for him and his party." Now, the Times also attempted to defend Biden with this follow-up line. More than a dozen current and former senior officials and advisors uniformly reported that Mr. Biden remained intellectually engaged, asking smart questions at meetings, grilling aides on points of dispute, calling them late at night. Okay. But the heat is clearly on. And if the numbers don't get a lot better, here's what I want to know. If you're the Democrats, how do you force out the President of the United States, the leader of the party and the free world? Do you keep up a media campaign expressing doubts about his running again? Do you allow a likely Republican-led Congress to do some deep investigative digging without much pushback? How and when would Democrats let Biden know they don't want him to run, and maybe even won't support him if he does? Joining us now is Democratic pollster Bradley Honan, who has written about this very topic at length. Thanks very much for coming on the show. Appreciate it. All right. So what do you think about what I just mentioned, about the possibility of a sort of a whisper campaign designed to undermine Biden's re-election bid?
Dan, I think what we're starting to see here are very nervous Democrats expressing real reservations with President Biden and looking at issues like inflation, high gas prices, nipping at the heels of voters every time they get to the checkout line, every time they pull up to the gas pump. And I think looking ahead to November, Democrats are seeing a possibly historic shellacking that's going to cost the party at least 50 seats, maybe even 70 to 80 seats, and thus control of the House of Representatives. And as they look at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, they see a commander-in-chief, a president of the United States, a standard bearer of the Democratic Party, unable to do a couple of things. One, fire up the base and get them enthusiastic about his agenda and what's on the ballot this November. Two, an inability to make significant inroads with critical groups of swing voters like Latinos and suburban women, soccer moms of the kind that have been so critical in past elections. And third, a president who's unable or unwilling to take on the far left part of the party, the Democratic Socialists, and create some distance there. So whether it's age, whether it's a lack of political acumen, President Biden is unable to meet the moment in a lot of Democrats. And that's why I think you're seeing this whisper campaign start to begin.
I want to go through the three strategies that you've laid out that Democrats may have in their pockets. I want to get through all three of them, so if you can let's go through them pretty quickly. You say that number one could be Democratic candidates in the midterm campaign. Talk to us about it.
I think an example of this was Tim Ryan in Ohio, who said, I don't want to be in the same room. I don't want to be on the stage as President Biden, and even calling out in his advertisements praise that he's gotten from Fox News. I think Democrats in the heartland are saying the president is politically toxic and I don't want him near me.
All right, so that's number one. Number two is you cite fundraisers and power brokers as another potential, more than hint, to the president that he shouldn't run.
The president should be barnstorming the country, firing up the base and saying to Democrats, I'm on it, I get it, I hear you. He's not doing that. At the same time, given the political headwinds the Democrats are facing, he needs to be raising mountains and mountains of political cash, and he's not doing that. And that says something about the White House's ability to extend Biden out into the country and raise real money. They're getting a lot of people that say, I'm not ready to donate, not now, why don't we wait?
And number three that you cite is probably the biggest hint of all, which is that a slew of fellow Democrats are throwing their hat into the ring, even if not officially, right?
Democrats are not pack animals. We're not herd species. We don't stick together on the best of days, Dan, as you know. But what we're seeing from the vice president in terms of the clip you played, and there were several others that she has made not definitive statements that Biden is going to run. We're seeing the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, even running television ads in the state of Florida, and the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, even refusing to rule out the possibility that there's going to be a primary challenge to Joe Biden. And I think all of these are expressions of dissatisfaction and ambitious politicians, frankly, running trial balloons up to see whether there is a movement for them, but more broadly to ask Biden to step aside.
Really quickly, I've been scolded by many Biden supporters who say, you know, this is too early. Who knows what's going to happen? Things can change. You buy that?
You know, in fairness to Joe Biden, he has put together a historic coalition to take on and fight Vladimir Putin. He's kept the Chinese on the sidelines. He's passed a substantial bipartisan infrastructure bill, and with his help, the administration has gotten millions upon millions of people vaccinated. But Dan, you're right. He is running out of time, and what he needs and what he's probably laying in bed at night, every night, thinking about is whether he wants a two-edged sword by the name of Donald Trump to re-enter the political fray.
Well, I think that's Bradley Honan, who wants to be kind to his fellow Democrats' way of saying it's not happening, and there won't be anything that can significantly change it. Bradley Honan, thank you so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Good to see you. Take care.
Coming up, thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.